The transit platform waiting hall at Threshkale Outer Margin Station 4 had 47 seats. I know because I counted them on the way in, old habit from 12 years of infrastructure assessments, where you learn to count before you sit down, because how a space fills tells you more about its structural problems than any report does. A full hall means the ventilation's adequate and the seating surface is tolerable. A half-empty hall means something's wrong with the panel calibration or the ambient temperature or the noise profile. An entirely empty hall at a transit station running a 2-hour departure hold means something else entirely. I registered all of that and sat down anyway, because the seat I chose was close to the departure board and I was tired. 9 months I'd been out on the outer margin circuit. Longest posting I'd taken since Myra died, 3 years back. I'd been filling my schedule in the particular way that widowers do when they don't yet know what else to fill it with. Each posting longer than the last, each outer margin installation a little more remote. The return trips home to the apartment I hadn't quite gotten around to redecorating getting shorter. I wasn't running from anything, I'd told myself for most of the 9 months. I was just doing the work. There was always more work on the outer margin. The Threshold 9 assessment had been the most recent. 11 structural concerns in the primary loading corridor, 8 maintenance flags in the climate exchange system, a panel calibration issue in the medical bay that had been causing problems for species with electromagnetic sensitivity, and a station administrator who had pushed back on every single finding until I'd produced 4 separate supporting reports and CC'd his regional oversight officer. The flag filings were in the system. The work was done. I was going home. 2-hour departure hold. Loading irregularity on the transit connector, the counter attendant had said, with the particular vacancy of a person who has repeated the same sentence 15 times in the past hour, and no longer hears themselves saying it. I walked into the waiting hall, registered the 47 seats and the overhead panel flickering in the northern section, and the climate circulation running 3 degrees below the posted setting, and the bench surface that hadn't been recalibrated in at least 4 years, and went to the nearest seat that was close to the departure board, which happened to be the middle of the long bench that ran the length of the east wall, which happened to be approximately 3 feet from the only other person in the room. I sat down, pulled my kit bag onto my lap, and started going through the maintenance assessment addendum I'd been writing up for Threshold 9. 11 structural concerns had become 13 during my last walkthrough. I'd found 2 load-bearing joint issues in the secondary corridor that hadn't been in the original report, and I was documenting them before I forgot the specific measurements. I was aware, in the peripheral way you're aware of most things after enough years on the outer margin, that the woman at the end of the bench had gone very still when I sat down. I filed that observation the way I filed the panel flicker and the climate variance, noted, not urgent, continue with the work in front of you. It was about 40 seconds later that I noticed the hall was otherwise empty. I looked up to check the departure board, and I registered it properly. 46 empty seats, not one of them occupied, and every person who had been in this waiting space. I could see them through the entrance arch, clustered at the secondary seating area outside, which had no roof and which was, by my earlier read of the station's exterior temperature display, running about 6 degrees colder than the hall, had chosen to stand in the cold rather than sit in here. 2 hours and 14 minutes remaining on the departure hold. I looked at the departure board. I looked at the 46 empty seats. I looked at the woman 3 feet to my left. She was tall, even seated. The kind of height you notice not because of the measurement itself, but because of the way it carries, upright and precise, every degree of it deliberate, like a structure that knows its own load-bearing capacity and is not in the business of apologizing for it. Pale ash-gray skin, the particular quality that I recognized from outer margin postings as Velkareth caste. I'd worked with Velkareth administrative personnel twice in my compact service years, and once more independently at Kethsorn Station 9, though I'd never thought much about caste designations as a category. People on the outer margin were mostly whoever the posting needed. Close-cropped dark hair. Her hands were flat on her knees, absolutely still in a way that was not relaxation, but its opposite, the stillness of something that has gone very quiet so that it does not do anything it didn't intend to. Her eyes were pale copper, wide in the way that isn't alarm but is something older and more controlled than alarm, the specific quality of a trained observer who has been watching for threats long enough that the watching has become the baseline. Those eyes were on the departure board. And then I saw the light. Subtle, the kind of thing you'd miss entirely if you weren't specifically trained to notice variations in the expected visual field. I was. 12 years of infrastructure assessment in low-light frontier installations will do that to a person. You learn to see the thing that doesn't belong, the fracture line in the panel, the variance in the material stress, the data point that sits outside the expected range and means something is off. The faint blue luminescence ran in a thin line along the outer edge of her forearm, barely visible, starting at the wrist, pulsing at intervals I would later understand corresponded to her breathing. It was, objectively, the most controlled I'd ever seen a stress response display operate, contained to that single line, managed down to almost nothing, the kind of compression that takes years of practice. I looked at the overhead panel. The overhead panel was stuttering. 3-second cycle on, stutter on directly above the north section of the bench, directly above us. I looked at the luminescence. I looked at the panel. I ran the connection in my head the same way I ran structural load calculations, input, variable, output. The relay housing on that panel had a calibration fault. Calibration faults in relay housing produced electromagnetic variance. The variance was presumably above the Velkareth sensitivity threshold. The display was a stress response to the variance. Not to me, not to the 46 empty seats, not to any choice or intent on anyone's part. It was information about the environment, the same way a stress fracture in a load-bearing joint was information about the environment. It meant the panel needed maintenance. "The overhead panel," I said, "does it bother you?" She turned her head and looked at me. The copper eyes were extraordinary up close, not because of the color, though the color was unusual, but because of the quality of attention behind them. The kind of attention that has been carefully banked for a very long time, like a control instrument running at partial output to avoid triggering any of the feedback systems it's connected to. Every calibration set to minimum output, everything held in reserve. She said nothing. "It's running a stutter cycle," I said, 3-second interval. Calibration fault in the relay housing. That flicker pattern usually means the contact rail is wearing unevenly, and the relay's compensating by pulling more from the main line on the reset cycle, which creates a variance pulse. I looked at the panel. I put in 17 maintenance flags last month across the Thresholvath 9 station for the same issue. Different station, same systemic neglect. I looked at my assessment pad. I'm going to assume nobody's filed anything on this one either, given the general state of the bench surface. Silence. "You're sitting here," she said. It was not an accusation. It was the statement of a person who has had this observation need to be made explicit many times before and has learned to make it early, because the alternative is watching someone work their way to the conclusion more slowly. "Yes." Everyone else left. "I noticed," I said. "The panel's bad in the secondary seating area too, and there's no roof. My joints have enough problems without adding 6 degrees of cold to them." I turned a page on my assessment pad. "I'm Sale Vorn, infrastructure assessor, formerly Compact Frontier Service, now independent contractor. I've been on the outer margin for 9 months, and I'm tired enough that proximity to the departure board was my primary seating criterion." I looked at her briefly. "If you'd prefer that I move, I'll move. But I'd rather stay near the board." Another silence. This one had a different quality, not the braced, waiting for flight silence, but something that was genuinely trying to recalibrate. Like a system that has been running one expected outcome for long enough that an unexpected outcome requires it to actually restart the calculation. "Keithra," she said. The word landed carefully, as if she were checking whether it would cause a reaction before she committed to having said it. "Good to know," I said, and turned back to the Threshoveth 9 addendum. She didn't say anything else for 20 minutes. I didn't either. I was genuinely reading. The secondary corridor joint issues needed precise documentation. Load-bearing joint failures in outer margin installations had a pattern of being dismissed as minor until they weren't, and the supporting documentation for a flag filing needed to be tight enough that no administrator could reasonably push back on it. I'd been writing and revising this section for 3 days, and it still wasn't as clean as I wanted it. When I next looked up to check the departure board, 80 minutes remained. The luminescence had changed. Still faint, still controlled, but it had spread from the wrist to approximately the midpoint of her forearm, and the pulse interval had shortened, not dramatically. But the pattern was different, and the panel above us was still stuttering, and I ran the calculation again. "The calibration fault in that relay is producing a variance pulse on the 3-second reset," I said, without looking up from my pad. "Some species have electromagnetic sensitivity that extends beyond the standard human range. If that's what's activating the display, the source is the panel, not anything in the ambient environment otherwise." I looked up at the panel. "I can move further down the bench if the proximity makes it worse. The variance would still reach you from this distance, but moving 6 feet to the south would put you outside the primary emission radius." A pause. "You're not afraid of it," she said. "Of the display?" No, I thought about why that was true, genuinely, rather than just stating it. I can see it's tied to the panel cycle. The pulse interval matches the relay reset. That's not a threat display, that's a stress response to an external irritant that's been running for, I checked the time, approximately 2 hours and 45 minutes since this hold started and you presumably took this seat. I looked at the panel. The irritant is the panel. The panel is a maintenance problem. I've been looking at maintenance problems for 22 years and they don't frighten me. They frustrate me. Something very small happened in her face. "I have a handheld assessment tool," I said, pulling it out of my bag. Standard field instrument, gave electromagnetic variance readings and material stress data, the kind of thing every assessor carried. I pointed it at the overhead panel and read the output, 0.37 above station baseline. That's consistent with what I'd expect from a worn contact rail on a relay in the later stage of calibration drift. I put the tool away and wrote the number down on my pad. "I'm going to file a maintenance flag before we board. The station security office is on level 2. She was watching me. "That's not a thing people usually do," she said. "File maintenance reports on my behalf." "It's not on your behalf specifically," I said. "It's because the panel is out of spec, and it's going to cause problems for anyone with above baseline electromagnetic sensitivity who uses this hall. And there's apparently a gap in the local maintenance filing system, and I have the assessment tool and the documentation and 22 years of experience making the case for why these things matter." I looked up. "Though I suppose it's also on your behalf. Both things can be true." The silence this time had a different weight. "What made you notice," she said, "that the display was connected to the panel?" "I read structural stress for a living," I said. "What I'm trained to notice is the thing in the visual field that doesn't match the expected pattern, the fracture line, the variance, the data point that sits outside the normal range. The luminescence has a pulse interval. The panel has a reset cycle. They matched." I shrugged. "Everyone else in this hall looked at the display and made an assessment about intent. I looked at the display and looked for the cause." She was very still. 14 months, she said. I looked at her. "I've been on the outer margin circuit for 14 months, she said. "Assessment posting. Every time the display activates in a transit hall or a waiting area or a loading platform, she stopped. Began again with the careful precision of someone who has measured this sentence many times in the past 14 months and is still not certain it won't cost her something to say. People leave, or they report me to platform security, which takes 30 minutes and achieves nothing except making me miss the first boarding wave. Or they ask me to relocate to a contained holding area, which the stations are required to offer under compact transit protocol, but which is usually a supply closet with inadequate ventilation. A pause. This is the first transit hall in 14 months where I've had someone sit down and ask about the overhead panel. I thought about that for a moment, the arithmetic of it. 14 months of outer margin transit stops, each one with a waiting hall, each one with other people in it, each one ending the same way. I thought about what that would do to a person's baseline calibration, what it would do to the quality of watchfulness in those copper eyes, what it would teach you about what you could expect. The panel should have been maintained, I said. That's the beginning and end of what's wrong here from a structural standpoint. Someone didn't file the flag. The rail wore down. The relay started compensating with variance pulses. The hall became hostile to anyone with above baseline sensitivity. I started writing up the maintenance flag documentation. How long has this station been on the outer margin circuit? 11 years at this designation, she said. Upgraded from a secondary way station 7 years ago. Relay housing on the northern section is likely original installation then, I said. Contact rail wear on original outer margin relay housing runs to calibration failure in 8 to 10 years under normal load. They're at 11. This panel has been out of spec for at least a year, probably longer. I wrote that into the flag documentation. The station administrator is going to get a detailed report along with the flag filing. She said nothing for a moment. Then carefully, "You're taking this very seriously." "It's a serious problem," I said. "You've been dealing with it for 14 months across every transit stop on the circuit. That's a systemic failure." I looked at the flag documentation. "What's your destination at the end of this connector?" "Velkarath Station 7, she said. "I'm completing the assessment circuit and submitting my documentation to the council." "And before 7, how many stops on this particular run?" "Threscale to 7 is direct, no intermediate stops." "Then the flag at this station is the most immediate need," I said. "Though I'd like to know which other stations on your circuit had similar panel issues. If there's a pattern in the maintenance failures, the flag documentation is stronger with the comparative data." She looked at me. "You want my assessment data," she said, "to support a maintenance flag." "If you're willing to share the relevant sections," I said. "You don't have to." She stopped. Something in her expression did a small thing that I didn't have a precise name for, not confusion, something adjacent to confusion but with a different valence. "Yes," she said, "I can share the relevant sections." We talked for the rest of the 2 hours. It began with the panel documentation. She pulled up her outer margin circuit assessment files and walked me through the electromagnetic variance readings she'd been quietly taking at every transit stop for 14 months, because she'd been taking them since Ketharon Station 2, where the panel issue had first caused a security report, and she'd decided the only useful response to a recurring problem was to document it systematically. The data was thorough. More thorough than I'd expected. She had methodology notes alongside each reading, a consistent documentation format across 32 stops, and a comparative analysis section that she'd started writing at stop 19 when the pattern became undeniable. "This is good work," I said, reading through it. "It won't matter without the budget argument," she said. "The council will look at 32 data points and 43 flag filings, and they'll say the stations need to address the issue individually through their standard maintenance channels." She looked at her hands. "Which is what the station's standard maintenance channels will say as well, and none of them will do anything. That's because you're presenting it as a maintenance documentation problem, I said. What you have here is a cost projection problem. The panel failures aren't random. They're following the standard calibration drift curve for original outer margin installation relay housing at year 9 to 12 of operation, which means you can model the failure cascade, which means you can calculate the total remediation cost of letting every out-of spec relay in the outer margin circuit fail versus the maintenance cost of scheduled replacement at the 8-year mark. I sat back. Those numbers will be significantly different, and the difference is the argument. She was looking at me with the full quality of that attention, all of it deployed now, nothing banked. You've made this argument before, she said. Twice, Kethsorn 12 and Threshoveth 7. Both took about 8 months from initial submission to budget reallocation. The Threshoveth 7 one was faster because I had the Kethsorn 12 outcome as a case study, and I submitted them together. I looked at her circuit data. With 32 data points and the failure cascade model, you'd have a substantially stronger submission package than either of those. I don't have the failure cascade model, she said. I do, I said. I built it for the Kethsorn submission. It needs updating for current outer margin installation parameters, but the framework is solid. I looked at the departure board, an hour remaining. I can send it to you when we're on the transit, along with the 2 case study reports. The luminescence at her wrist had faded. I noticed it the same way I'd noticed its presence, peripherally, then directly, and I noted that the panel above us had gone to a longer interval between stutters, which probably meant the relay was in a cooler part of its cycle, and the variance had dropped momentarily. The Velkareth Council, she said. They commissioned this circuit assessment specifically because the outer margin infrastructure issues have been affecting Velkareth diplomatic and administrative personnel for 3 years. I was the 7th assessor they sent. The first 6 came back with documentation that the council looked at and set aside because the remediation cost estimates were too high, and there was no comparative framework showing the alternative cost. She paused. They sent me because I have an engineering background in addition to the administrative designation. They thought I might find something the others hadn't. You did, I said. 32 variance readings with consistent methodology across the full circuit is more than the others had. The cascade model is what you needed to pair with it. I looked at her data again. What's your submission timeline? 2 weeks after reaching Station 7, she said. I have the preliminary report drafted. I've been revising the remediation section for 6 weeks, and it still doesn't say what I need it to say. The remediation section shouldn't be about the cost of fixing the panels, I said. It should be about the cost of not fixing them. That's the reframe. I made a note on my pad. I'll put together a remediation framework template based on the Kethsorn model and adapt it to your circuit data. You'd need to populate the station-specific numbers, but the structural argument will be built in. She was quiet. I was writing, and the panel above us cycled through its stutter, and outside the arch the cluster of people in the secondary seating area was visible, standing, in the cold, choosing it. Can I ask you something? I said. She looked at me. The first stop on the circuit, before the security report started, what happened? A pause. Ketharon 1, she said. 6 hours into the first posting. I was in the main transit concourse waiting for a connecting platform assignment. The concourse was busy. It's a junction station, 200 people at peak hours. The overhead array was running at full output, and the calibration was standard for the species mix, which is mostly human and compact affiliate, not calibrated for Velkareth sensitivity. She laid each sentence down the way you lay a foundation level, exact, nothing approximate. The display activated at the same time that a child near me started crying. A human child, perhaps 3 years old, overtired and confused by the noise. The child's parents saw the display, assumed a connection, and called for platform security. What happened with security? They asked me to relocate to the secondary holding area, she said, which I did. The secondary holding area at Ketharon 1 is a corridor segment near the service lifts. No seating, adequate lighting. I was there for 4 hours while the connecting platform assignment processed. She said it without inflection, the same flat precision she used for variance readings. And the 32 that followed, I said. Variations on the same pattern, different stations, different triggers, sometimes the panels, sometimes crowd density, sometimes both. Some stops were better. Ketharon 7 has well-maintained panel calibration throughout, and I had a full transit window there without incident. Velorveth 3 had no overhead panels at all, emergency lighting only, due to a maintenance failure, which was, paradoxically, the best panel environment I encountered in the circuit, because there was no variance to respond to. I thought about that. The station running on emergency lighting being the most hospitable environment she'd found in 14 months of work. Did you file reports at each stop? 43 flag filings, she said, 32 variance readings, 11 security incident reports, 1 formal complaint at Threscale 7, where the holding area they assigned me to had a panel with worse calibration than the main hall. A pause. That one I escalated myself. It moved within 48 hours. They don't usually escalate. Something in that, the small precise satisfaction of a person who has learned to find wins in very specific places, made me stop writing and look at her. You kept working through all of it, I said. The assessment was the assignment, she said. The circuit was real work and the council needed the documentation. The conditions were suboptimal, but the work was still the work. I sat with that for a moment. Salvorn, she said. Yes. Why are you on the outer margin? Independent, I mean, you said 12 years compact and 10 independent. That's a long time to stay out here. I thought about how to answer honestly rather than approximately. My wife died 3 years ago, I said. Cardiac event, she was 44. Structural engineer, commercial buildings on the inner circuit stations, the new residential construction. After that I stayed busy. The outer margin stays busy. There's always a posting, always a station that needs someone to look at it and write down what's wrong with it. I looked at my pad. I've been meaning to go back to the apartment for about 8 months. She was quiet. I'm sorry about your wife, she said. Thank you, I looked at the board. She would have had the Cascade model argument in 20 minutes. I worked it out over 8 months. The argument is good, she said, however long it took. It was a long 8 months, I said. Outside the arch, the crowd had not moved back in. The hall was ours, bad panel, cold climate units, and we had been working in it for 90 minutes, and it was real work, and it occurred to me that this was the longest sustained professional conversation I'd had since the last time I'd been working alongside someone who was genuinely interested in the same problems. Outside the entrance arch, I could see that the crowd in the secondary seating area had grown, more people arriving from other platform connections, the departure hold drawing transit passengers into the station. All of them, without exception, looking in through the arch and then going to the secondary area. 1 or 2 of them looking in a second time, with a particular quality of confirming glance. I watched them and thought about 14 months. Keithra, I said. She turned. What does it feel like, the variance, when the display activates? She looked at me for a moment with those copper eyes. Like noise, she said. In a register you can't tune out, low frequency, persistent. You can manage it, but you can't silence it, and managing it takes resources. A pause, energy, attention. The management takes attention that should be going elsewhere. She looked at the panel. In a controlled environment with proper panel calibration, the baseline variance is low enough that the management is automatic. But outer margin installations have never been maintained to the standard that would keep it at that level. A longer pause. I've been spending most of 14 months managing it instead of doing the assessment work. And still producing 32 data points and a preliminary report draft, I said. She looked at me. That's the assessment, I said. That's the case study you lead with, not the panel failures, the assessor who spent 14 months managing unaddressed environmental interference and still produced a better documentation package than the 6 who preceded her. That's what the council needs to understand about the cost. It's not just the panels. It's what the panels cost in attention and capacity across every person traveling the outer margin circuit who has above baseline sensitivity. I was writing notes as I talked, because the structure of the argument was assembling itself, and I needed to record it before it settled. How many Velkareth personnel travel the outer margin circuit annually? Across all designations, she thought about it, approximately 420. And what percentage would have above baseline electromagnetic sensitivity? Velkareth caste designation requires it, she said. All of them. It's a physiological marker of the caste classification. I wrote that down. 420 personnel, I said. All of them managing unaddressed environmental interference at every transit stop. Multiply by the average management load per stop. Multiply by the number of stops per annual circuit, calculate the capacity cost in assessment output reduction or error rate increase or mission time extension. I looked up. That's the argument, not the panel cost, the capacity cost. She was staring at me. That framework, she said, has it been developed, the capacity cost model? Not for this specific application, I said. But I built a version of it for the Thresholvath 7 submission. We were making the case for HVAC upgrades in the assessment bays, and the argument was about assessor output reduction under substandard climate conditions. Same structure, different variables. I was already thinking through the adaptation. It would need to be rebuilt with the electromagnetic sensitivity parameters and the Velkareth caste prevalence data, but the underlying model is straightforward. She said nothing for a long moment. Then, who are you, Salvorn? I looked up from my notes. Infrastructure assessor, I said. Former Compact Frontier Service. 12 years on the public side, 10 independent. I specialize in outer margin installation maintenance deficiency identification and remediation cost modeling. A pause. I'm also the person who sat down 3 feet from you because the seat was close to the departure board, and I've been finding this conversation significantly more useful than the assessment addendum I've been trying to finish for 3 days. The thing happened in her face again, that careful 2mm release. But this time it was larger, not 2mm but something more, something that changed the line of her jaw and the angle of her shoulders, and the way she was holding her hands on her knees. In 14 months, she said, no one has stayed long enough to ask a second question. I looked at the board, 20 minutes remaining. The maintenance flag, I said. I need to file it before we board. I'll come with you, she said. We walked to the level 2 security office together. The south corridor was quieter than the main transit concourse service traffic. A few station personnel, the hum of the climate exchange units which I noted as we passed were also running below spec, though by a smaller margin than the main hall. 0.6 below, I estimated. I'd flag it as a secondary item. She walked at my pace, which was not a small thing. I'd seen how she walked in the hall, the measured deliberateness of someone who calculates the radius of their effect before they move through any space. Here, in the corridor, with fewer people and no overhead panel stuttering above us, she walked differently. Still precise, still upright, but with less of the weight of management behind each step. The desk officer at the security office was a young, compact affiliate woman who looked up when we came in and spent approximately 2 seconds running the same calculation that everyone in the main hall had run, except that she was behind a desk, and it was her professional responsibility not to act on it. I gave her credit for that. I submitted the flag documentation while Keithra stood beside me, and the desk officer looked at us both with the expression of someone who is trying to reconcile 2 or 3 things at once and not quite succeeding. Primary and supporting documentation attached, I said. 0.37 electromagnetic variance above station baseline in the north section of the main waiting hall. Source identified as relay housing calibration fault on contact rail. Estimated unit age 11 years at current designation, plus 7 prior, as secondary way station. Probable onset of calibration drift, estimated at least 14 months ago based on external circuit assessment data. Remediation recommendation, contact rail replacement and full relay recalibration, estimated 3 to 5 days, minimum environmental disruption. I signed the flag form. I'm also flagging the climate exchange units in the South Corridor, which are running 0.9 below spec. Lower priority but should be in the maintenance queue. The desk officer was typing. The flag is in the system, he said. Response time. Outer margin standard is 6 to 9 months, I said. I know. I'd appreciate it if you flagged it internally as affecting documented traveler welfare, which typically moves it to the accelerated queue. He looked at me. He looked at Keithra. He typed something additional. Flagged, he said. We walked back to the waiting hall. The departure board had moved to boarding open. The crowd from outside was beginning to file in. At the corridor entrance to the transit boarding, she stopped. I stopped beside her. The hall was filling now. People coming in from the secondary seating area, from the connecting platforms, from the service corridors. Moving around the long east bench with the particular unconscious navigation of a crowd that has already been taught, through some mechanism of collective awareness that requires no individual knowledge, where not to be. The bench emptied itself again the moment she stepped back toward it, almost as fast as the original evacuation. I watched that happen. She watched it happen too, with those copper eyes that had been watching it happen in every transit hall in the outer margin circuit for 14 months. Boarding, I said. Yes, she picked up her travel pack. I want to say, she stopped, tried again. Sail Vorn, what you did this afternoon, the flag, the documentation, the framework, it matters for the submission. A pause. And also, the overhead panel should have been maintained, I said. You shouldn't have spent 14 months managing it. That's the structural fact. Everything else we built this afternoon is just the argument for making that fact actionable. I looked at her. The framework will be in your submission queue by the time you reach Station 7. I'll have it drafted on the transit. She looked at me. That's not what I was going to say, she said. I waited. I was going to say, she said, with the careful precision of someone choosing the exact words, that sitting in that hall for 2 hours without spending any of it managing the crowd around me, I'd forgotten that was possible. I'd started to think I'd just recalibrated to the version where it wasn't. She looked at her hands. The luminescence was absent entirely now. I'd forgotten what it was like when someone asked about the panel instead of moving away from it. I thought about that, about the arithmetic of 14 months of transit halls, about what it cost, in the particular currency of attention and baseline calibration, to spend that long managing something that should have been a maintained environment. The framework submission, I said. The council needs to hear the capacity cost argument from someone with your assessment data and the CAS prevalence numbers. I can build the model, but you'll need to populate it and present it. Are you planning to attend the presentation session? Yes, she said. Then I'd like to know how it lands, I said. Whether the remediation cost argument moves them, or whether there's a gap in the presentation I should help you close. She looked at me. She stopped. That would take several weeks. The council session is in 6 weeks. Then you have time to send me a draft before the session, I said. I'll review the framework sections. Outer margin budget arguments have specific language patterns that tend to move allocation committees, and I've learned most of them the hard way. The boarding announcement overhead, first wave, transit connector, Velkareth Station 7. You should go, I said. First wave gives you better seat selection. I know, she said. She wasn't moving. The copper eyes were on me. Sit down for a minute, she said. I looked at her. Please. The word was precise and deliberate, and she was looking at me without any of the banked quality in those eyes, all of it present, all of it visible. Sit down for a minute, Sale Vorn. I sat down. She sat down. The boarding crowd moved past us, filing toward the corridor entrance, and the long east bench was empty again except for the two of us, and the overhead panel was still stuttering in its 3-second cycle. Contact rail still worn, variant still pulsing, the flag in the system now but the maintenance not done yet, and I sat with that and let the crowd move past. The hall was different with the crowd gone, quieter, and the climate units audible now at the edge of hearing, and the departure board ticking down. I thought about the Thresshorveth 9 addendum sitting on my pad, and I thought about the apartment I'd been meaning to go back to for 8 months, and I thought about the particular quality of the past 2 hours, which had not felt long. Can I ask you one more thing? I said. She looked at me. When the council reviews your submission, the framework, the cascade model, the capacity cost argument, what outcome do you actually need? Not the optimistic outcome, the minimum one that constitutes success. She thought about it. Scheduled relay replacement across the primary outer margin transit network, 8-year maintenance cycles, with the electromagnetics calibration standard updated to reflect the species mix that actually uses the circuit. A pause. 3 years to implement. Realistically. That's achievable, I said. The Kethsorn remediation ran to budget in 22 months, and that was a more complex installation set. Your circuit data is cleaner than mine was at the point of submission. I looked at the board. The council will push back on the timeline. They'll say 3 years is aggressive. Offer 4 with a 2-year review milestone. They'll take 4. She was looking at me steadily. You've done this enough times, she said, that you know how the negotiation goes. I've been doing it for 22 years, I said. The technical case is never the problem. The technical case is usually right. The problem is always the same problem. Someone in the approval chain who needs a reason to say yes that isn't just this is the correct thing to do. Find that person, give them that reason, and the rest follows. I looked at my pad. In your case, the reason is the capacity cost model. 43 flag filings and 32 variance readings are documentation of a problem. The capacity cost model is documentation of what the problem is costing the council in terms they already measure. That's the reason. She said nothing for a moment. You should be a procurement consultant, she said. I've been offered, I said. I find the field work more interesting. I looked at the south end of the hall where the climate units were still running below spec. Sitting in a room looking at budget documents is less satisfying than sitting in a waiting hall looking at a panel that needs maintenance. Even a waiting hall with a bad panel, she said. Especially, I said. Something moved through her face, slow and quiet, the kind of thing that doesn't have a name in most languages because it requires a specific combination of circumstances that most people don't experience. The recognition of finding something you'd stopped expecting to find in a place you weren't looking. The Velkareth Station 7 East connecting platform, she said. There's a waiting area on the east side past the first climate exchange units. I've been through it before. The panel calibration is correct. The bench surface was replaced last year. A pause. I have a 40-minute transfer window before the Kethsorveth connector boards. I looked at the main departure board. I have a 40-minute transfer window at 7 as well, I said. Something settled in her face. Carefully and small and entirely genuine. The quality of a structure that has been holding tension for a long time and has finally located a load-bearing element it trusts. The food distribution point runs until the second boarding wave, she said. The warm option is actually warm. I know because I checked, the last time I was through Station 7, which was 8 months ago, and I remember it because it was the first transit stop in 4 months where I'd eaten something hot. That's a lower bar than I'd hoped for, I said. Outer margin transit, she said. Fair, I said. The second boarding announcement. Final boarding wave, transit connector, Velkareth Station 7. We stood. She moved toward the corridor entrance, and I fell in beside her at the natural distance of two people who have been in the same space for 2 hours, not together in any performed sense, not apart in any deliberate sense, but with the ease of proximity that has been long enough that the proximity is no longer a question. The corridor lighting was better, as I'd predicted. The luminescence at her wrist was absent entirely. At the junction where the Velkareth connector branched from the main transit line, she stopped. I stopped. She looked at the junction board, then at me. The framework, she said. You'll send it before 7. I'll have it drafted before the connector docks, I said. Failure cascade model adapted to the outer margin relay parameters, capacity cost model adapted to the Velkareth cast prevalence numbers, both Keth Sorn and Threshoveth case studies formatted for council submission. I looked at the junction board. You'll need to populate the cast-specific physiological parameters for the capacity model. I don't have those numbers. I can get them from the council medical registry, she said. 24 hours. Then you'll have a complete package in 25 hours. She was looking at me with those pale copper eyes in the better calibrated corridor light, and the quality of attention there was different now from what it had been in the waiting hall. All of it present and none of it braced, like a system that has found an unexpected point of stability and has stopped running its failure detection protocols for the first time in a long time. Salvorn, she said. Yes. The east platform at Station 7, she said. First bench past the climate exchange units, the good ones. A pause. I'll be there for 40 minutes. I understood what she was not quite saying, and what she was precisely saying at the same time. I'll bring the draft framework and the case studies, I said. You don't have to bring anything, she said. I looked at her. No, I said, I don't. Something moved through her expression, quiet and careful and real, the kind of thing that had probably not had a lot of room to move freely in 14 months of outer margin transit halls. A line I would remember later, turning it over the way you turn over a load-bearing discovery, the specific texture of it, the way it changed the weight of the structure around it. She turned and boarded. I followed at the correct interval, and when I came through into the transit car, she was at the window seat in the 3rd row, and there was an empty seat across the aisle, and she didn't look at me directly when I sat down, but the line of her shoulders had changed. Not the deliberate uprightness of the waiting hall, but something that had found a different kind of calibration. I opened my assessment pad. The Threshoveth 9 addendum could wait. The framework was more urgent, and I had 40 minutes of transit time and a council submission to build, and the woman across the aisle from me had been trying for 14 months to solve a problem I'd spent 22 years developing tools for. And I was, I noticed, no longer tired in the way I'd been tired when I walked into the waiting hall. Outside the transit window, the outer margin dark moved past. The departure board above the car door counted down to Velkareth Station 7. I pulled up the Keth Sorn 12 remediation report and started adapting the failure cascade model. The overhead panel in the transit car was running at perfect calibration. No flicker, no variance, no stutter cycle. The kind of quiet that comes from a system maintained the way systems should be maintained, not exceptional, just correct. The baseline that should be everywhere and usually wasn't. I looked across the aisle. She had her own assessment pad open. Her copper eyes were moving across whatever she was reading, the preliminary report probably, or the variance data, or some section of the submission she'd been revising for 6 weeks. She hadn't said anything since we'd found our seats, and I hadn't said anything either, and the silence between us was the comfortable kind. The kind that two people fall into when they're doing parallel work and don't need to fill the space with anything else. I noted that distinction, filed it, went back to the Keth Sorn report. The failure cascade model needed adapting at 3 points: the baseline parameters, the maintenance cycle assumptions, and the population exposure estimates. The first 2 I could do from the circuit data she'd shared. The third was the Velkareth cast prevalence number, 420, multiplied by the average number of transit stops per outer margin circuit, which I didn't have precisely but could estimate from the 32-stop dataset she'd given me. I was halfway through the baseline parameter revision when she said, without looking up from her pad, "The average circuit on the outer margin run is 38 stops. 32 was a shortened circuit. I started at junction 3 instead of junction 1 because of a scheduling delay at the beginning of the posting." I looked at her. "You were listening to my math," I said. "You were writing numbers on your pad in a way that suggested you were estimating something that I had the actual figure for," she said. I wrote down 38. "That changes the capacity cost projection by about 9%, unfavorably." "For the stations," she said, "favorably for the argument." I looked at her. She was still reading her pad. "Yes," I said, "favorably for the argument." I went back to the model. 40 minutes to Station 7. The overhead panel ran clean and quiet above us, and the outer margin dark moved past the window, and the work was good work, and I made a note to include the transit car panel calibration in the framework introduction because it proved the point. When things were maintained correctly, they were simply quiet. That was the whole argument. The model was the arithmetic of what the quiet cost. And across the aisle from me was the person who had spent 14 months in the wrong kind of noise, and had still done the work, and was going to help make the case for why the quiet was worth paying for. I made a note to include that in the introduction too, not the arithmetic, the plain fact of it. Some things were worth saying directly.